Russia-Belarus, what is the Zapad 2025 exercise? Joint military exercises between Russia and Belarus have always worried Europe. This year even more so. These are the upcoming Zapad 2025, which will be held from 12 to September 16 and which, although veiled defensive, have undermined Belarus relations with its neighbors for over a decade. The fifth set of exercises, Zapad 2025, will be held in September, scaled down and moved further away from the border, although it continues to arouse suspicion after the last joint exercise, Union Resolve in early 2022, was used to mask the buildup of a Russian assault force that raided Ukraine in February of that year. This time, according to Belarusian experts interviewed by the Kiev Independent, an attack by Belarus on NATO countries is unlikely. At least for now. What are Zapad tutorials? Zapad, which means West in Russian, is one of the biennial Russia-Belarus joint military exercises held in September. It alternates with Union Shield exercises, the Russian part of the exercises, which in turn are part of a 4-year cycle of Russian military exercises. When held in Belarus, Zapad tends to alarm NATO member states because of its proximity to the borders with Poland and Lithuania. The exercises were launched in 2009 as part of the State of the Union program. The goal was to coordinate and train the regional military grouping, the Union Defense Force, which brought together the Belarusian Armed Forces and the 20th Joint Army of the Russian Guard of the Western Military District. Each Zapad military gathering is said to involve between 12,000 and 13,000 soldiers, although NATO has disputed the official numbers. As Kiev Independent reports referring to the numerous exercises held more or less at the same time, Western observers say that Russia has divided a major exercise into smaller exercises to avoid triggering the Vienna document, which requires transparency for large exercises. Simulations. As mentioned, officially defensive, Zapad scenarios typically involve an attack by terrorist groups from across the border or foreign-backed domestic unrest. In reality, the false adversaries are clearly meant to represent neighboring NATO member states. Zapad 2017 featured 3 fictitious states, Vesberia, Lubenia, and Vyshnoria, which resembled the Baltic states Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia and included territories in the Suwalki Gap, an area of land separating the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad Oblast and western Belarus. Vyshnoria, which occupies a part of western Belarus with a majority Catholic population, has been described as an area with separatist tendencies. The scenario was so far-fetched that it became an anti-regime meme in Belarus, with the fake country receiving a flag anthem, election committee, and a fake foreign ministry Twitter account. As a result, in 2022, the mention of Vyshnoria was branded as extremist by the Belarusian authorities. In 2017, after the signing of the Minsk agreements, Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko experienced a brief thaw with the West. To avoid further damaging relations with the West, he invited international observers and turned them away from the border. Similar moves will be repeated in 2025, albeit under completely different circumstances. Previous suspicions. After his alleged defeat in the 2020 presidential election, Lukashenko relied on Moscow's support to suppress national protests against manipulation of the result in his favor. Then, in response to Western sanctions, Lukashenko unleashed an artificial migration crisis, channeling irregular migrants to the EU's borders. The Zapad 2021 exercises reflected the deterioration of relations. The War Games scenario openly described the imaginary Western states that inspired uprisings in Belarus and then launched open aggression. Analysts from the Institute for the Study of War saw these exercises as a further step towards integrating Belarusian forces into Russian command structures. For the first time, the scope of the exercises has not been downplayed. Although Belarus was still home to around 12,800 soldiers, the total number of officially declared personnel involved has reached 200,000. The highest estimates by NATO experts on the total number of soldiers who had taken part in previous exercises did not exceed 100,000. Russia began preliminary training months before the 2021 exercises, practicing drone warfare and jamming communications. A southern element has also been introduced into the scenario involving Ukraine. Lukashenko spoke of a warming from the south during the acquisition of Russian S-400 air defense systems. At the end of September, the Belarusian army announced the complete withdrawal of Russian troops. The retreat and the ploy. However, Russia and Belarus announced lightning exercises, called Union Resolve, which were not governed by any treaty or agreement. The exercises served as cover to muster the strike force needed for Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The invasion has seen military cooperation between Russia and Belarus move from theory to practice. In October 2022, Lukashenko announced that the regional military grouping, previously trained during the Zapad exercises, would be deployed to Belarus, citing a growing threat on the borders of the Union state, writes Kiev Independent. According to the Belarusian monitoring group Hagen, which at the time had actively reported Russian troop movements in Belarus, the deployment was used to hide real training of mobilized Russian personnel at Belarusian training ranges, before being sent to Ukraine. The training, which would have involved up to 15,000 Russian soldiers, lasted until July 2023 and ended without any notification of the withdrawal of the regional military grouping. At the end of 2022, then Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu announced new Zapad exercises, only to cancel them in September 2023. British intelligence attributed the cancellation to the depletion of Russian military resources. The forecasts. Since then, the Zapad 2025 exercises have been kept secret for months, while the final location and number of troops changed every month. Initially, it was planned to involve up to 13,000 soldiers, but in May the exercises were scaled back and moved more to the center of the country and not to the borders. In July, Belarusian Deputy Defense Minister Pavel Muravica said Belarus could back down, citing the military activities of its Western colleagues. The activities mentioned were defensive exercises conducted in Lithuania and Poland, which in turn were launched in response to Zapad 2025. Meanwhile, in Lithuania, the Arsis Vilkas, Fierce Wolf 2025, exercises took place between 11 and August 22. From mid-August to the end of September, Poland hosts Iron Defender 25, a joint exercise with NATO allies, in which about 34,000 military personnel and about 600 units of military equipment participated. Belarus neighboring countries have also announced their withdrawal from the anti-mine treaty, which will allow them to fortify their borders with minefields. According to Lithuanian intelligence, Zapad 2025 is expected to include fewer troops than before, about 30,000 units in total, including 6,000 to 8,000 stationed in Belarus and some in the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad. According to the opposition watchdog Belpol, it is likely that the exercises have been reduced due to Russian losses in Ukraine and the lack of military means on the battlefield. The independent security think tank ISANS estimated that only about 2,150 Russian soldiers were stationed in Belarus in June, limited to their permanent headquarters, 2 Russian communication bases and an airport. On August 6, however, additional Russian troops began to arrive. Their exact number remains unknown. The Ukrainian State Border Guard Service has estimated that several hundred Russian soldiers and dozens of pieces of equipment have already arrived, quantities considered non-threatening. Political analyst Artyom Shrubman believes that a reduction similar to that of the 2017 exercises would have required Moscow's approval. Minsk could have been certain that no new offensive was planned and that the Kremlin currently had different priorities, and Lukashenko presented it as a gesture of peace, Shrubman commented to the Kiev Independent. Concerns. In a conversation with the Kiev Independent, Belpol representative Volodymyr Zhihar also stressed that military cooperation between Belarus and Russia is a long-term concern. Russia is investing in the Belarusian military-industrial complex to produce the weapons that have proven effective in the war against Ukraine. Launching large-scale military operations before these production facilities reach full capacity, without being able to protect them from retaliatory attacks, is impractical for Russian President Vladimir Putin, Zhihar said. According to him, Belarusian industrial enterprises and more than 200 commercial facilities are expected to reach full capacity by 2027 to 2028, producing about 300,000 152mm artillery shells, 450,000 122mm rockets for Grad multiple launch systems, up to 1,000 attack and reconnaissance drones, about 1 million small arms shells and 30 to 50 electronic warfare systems. Rather than an all-out attack, Belpol envisions a limited provocation in the medium term. Russia could try to seize territory in a NATO member state to see if this triggers Article 5 or if the United States and other major NATO countries refrain from intervening. Much will depend on their reaction. We can confidently say that by 2029 to 2030 Putin will still want to invade Europe and divide NATO, Zhir predicted, citing Belpol's military experts. Shrubman outlined other hypothetical scenarios for the Kremlin's provocations. Russia could reignite the migration crisis and trigger a deadly confrontation on the border, resume airstrikes against Ukraine to provoke retaliation on Belarus, which would trigger defense obligations under the military doctrine agreed between Belarus and Russia in December 2024, or it could increase tensions over access to Kaliningrad. However, all these scenarios are purely hypothetical, Shrubman concluded, adding that Belarus can still be treated as a separate actor from Moscow, which can be reminded of the cost of an all-out war.